考えたんですけど、皆さんを処刑しようかなって。
Well, at least this dude doesn't be around the bush about being an evil ranger. Eh? What do you mean this is his good personality?
So yeah, as of late, I think Precure has been having a little bit of a Six Ranger problem. I mean, honestly, I don't think it's all bad, as I think we've even got a really solid one recently. However, as of the time of this writing, I think we just finished off one of the sloppiest introductions for a new heroine in Delicious Party that has left me not all hopeful for the character's future prospects.
I mean, my opinion can always change, and I honestly hope they do win me over eventually, but I think for now, we need to ask one important question. What makes for a great Six Ranger?
While of course, every case is going to be different, I do think there are certain aspects that should be addressed. For instance, how strong should the new character be in comparison to their team? Sure, they should stand out, at least for their intro arc, but not to the point that it breaks the show's meta and makes most of the future enemy encounters feel like a foregone conclusion. On that note, the conflict should be escalating to the point that additional support should be warranted. Otherwise, at some point, it feels like the heroes are the ones bullying the bad guys.
And of course, above all else, a new character should have, well, character.
This inherently isn't always an easy task. When the new hero makes their debut, it will be relatively late into the series, and therefore they're just not going to be afforded the same quantity of spotlight episodes as their teammates to properly develop them. Now, there are ways of circumventing this lack of episodes that we'll get into later, but I think one of the most viable ways to build these characters effectively is by giving them a strong relationship with the leader of their team.
I mean, just from a pure marketing standpoint, it only makes sense.
The number 1 and 6 of the team are most likely going to be the biggest merch pushers since their faces will be on most of the products. Thus, elevating them both by having them work off one another will lead to good character development and more toy sales, wins all around. Unfortunately though, I feel like the latest season of Precure really only focused on that latter goal, as the character in question lacked any significant relationship with their leader in spite of them seemingly trying to build one.
So why exactly did it not work, and how could they have done it better in my opinion?
Well, for those answers, I think not only should we look towards the teams of the past, but also an adjacent franchise from the same company that's pretty much the license holder on the Six Ranger trope.
Thus, for these videos, we're just going to do a little retrospective for the Six Rangers across the Precure and Super Sentai franchises.
Of course, we're not going to do every single show with Six Ranger because 1, we'd be here all day, and 2, I actually haven't seen every Super Sentai. Not that I need to, because as I said, we're just going to be focusing on the series that really highlight this particular story element. Though we might also bring up some other franchises when relevant.
Otherwise, this is mostly going to be a Toei Duality video as we take a look at the importance of the relationship between the first and Six Rangers of the Precure and Super Sentai franchises. Do take note that this video is going to be full of spoilers, so if you're at all interested in some of these shows, do feel free to skip around. It's been broken down into some convenient chapters. And yes, this is also supposed to be kind of a pseudo-sequel to my original Six Ranger video that we did a long time ago, and was one of the things that really blew up this channel.
Back then, we ended by talking about Cure Scarlet, as Mahotsukai Precure was still in the middle of its run, and Cure Felice had only just been introduced. Obviously, a lot more Six Ranger Cures have debuted since then, and I know some of y'all do want to hear my opinions on them.
And while you could always just go watch some of my series reviews for my thoughts on some of those characters, I guess we could also do a little lightning round here, just to talk about characters we're not really going to bring up in these videos.
Fantastic designs for both her human and Cure form, but was a little overpowered, especially for a series that de-emphasized combat. Also, really wish they had used her alternate fairy forms a lot more, otherwise why even include them in the opening? Legit, one of the best characters from this season who showed the most selfless heroism, all the while promoting the idea that you actually need to work towards refining your skills in order to do stuff like starting up a business rather than just relying on a magical portable bakery. honestly not bad, and she did have some very amicable traits, and she could shred, but along with her partner, who we'll talk about later, did steal a little too much spotlight in the latter half of the series. Great backstory and interesting motivations that didn't get a lot of follow-up after she joined the team. Yeah, the inconsistent tone of this season really hurt this character, who did have to deal with a very tragic situation, and yet did she display much of a sense of urgency afterward?
Nope.
Lousy debut and way too overpowered at first, but she did get better as the series went on, as her bubbly nature of being a still relatively newborn in the body of a full-grown woman did become pretty hilarious. Again, more on her later.
For the first part of this retrospective, I think we should take a look back at some of the forerunners of this trope and try to figure out some of the base story elements that are still being applied to this day for the characters.
With that in mind, let's take things in chronological order with the actual originator of this trope. Yeah, okay, there is some argument that can be made that Big One, who we've talked about more than once on this channel, was at least a precursor to this concept, though in his case, more than a Sixth Ranger, he just became the new leader of his team out of nowhere.
I mean, it certainly wasn't a cheap ratings grab, or a means of changing the tone to something more kid-friendly in order to get the angry parents off their back or anything like that. So anyway, Kyroyu Sentai Zyuranger and Burai.
This was the 16 Super Sentai series, and featured a team of heroes that had been wakened from ancient times with their 90s haircuts to fight an evil witch with a Wizard of Oz motif. Though the character worth spotlighting was introduced in their 17th episode, which seems to be a standard debut episode these days for Six Rangers, and made quite the first impression. And unlike his Power Rangers equivalent, who we'll get to in just a bit, he was doing all of this willingly, as he had a major hate boner for the red of the team, Geki, who was also his biological brother. Yeah, on a rather complicated turn of events, the brothers were estranged thanks to the politics of the ancient kingdoms they were born in. As a result of it, Geki's adoptive father, the King of Yamato, aka Old Japan, killed their biological father when he tried to stage a rebellion. Filled with rage from seeing this firsthand, as well as the last words of his father telling him to seize the world that they were denied, Burai swore vengeance against the king. However, when Bandora beat him to the punch and destroyed Yamato, he shifted his malice towards his brother, going so far as to even seal himself away when he learned Geki had also done that in case Bandora ever returned.
Yeah, kind of an illogical little vendetta, considering that he knew full well that his literal baby brother at the time had nothing to do with their father's death. But again, childhood trauma that had been drilled into him by likely a domineering father, so he's not exactly thinking straight.
And ultimately, when he realized the fallacy in pursuing a conflict that was never theirs to begin with and had long since passed, he gave up his malice and joined the team. However, it would literally be short-lived, as in a cruel twist of irony, Burai had actually died during his little sleep because of a cave-in. The only reason he was alive was because of an intervention by the gods of the show, and they could only grant him less than a couple of days worth of life outside of a special chamber. Now, of course, theoretically, he could just stay in that chamber and live forever, but he knew he had to do the right thing for his brother, who he had wrongfully hated for so long, which led to his demise in the first place. And when his time did eventually run out, he passed on with no regrets, knowing that he had helped Geki and saved many lives in the process.
While Zyuranger itself is regarded as a very mid-Sentai season, especially considering what came right before it, Burai's arc is often cited as the major high point of the series.
His story just had so many good twists and turns, with him starting off as an arrogant antagonist driven by vengeance before being humbled and coming to realize how literally self-destructive such pursuits were. In turn, he really upped the stock of his little brother, who was otherwise one of the whitest of white meat baby faces. Seriously, Geki was a total tool, except for when interacting with his brother, and then he started to feel less like Doremi's dad and more like a genuine character. And in the end, the character proved to be a smash hit both for merch sales and TV ratings, with Burai's final episode being the biggest draw. Thus, Toei took note and would debut an extra hero almost every season afterwards. Wisely, they didn't immediately just make another face-turn antagonist the following season, as that would just get repetitive.
However, the character we did get for the next Sentai series was...
よろしくいや何すんのよおっぱいちっちゃいな
Yeah, say, how are the good old people across the pond in the US of A doing?
For the Power Rangers adaptation of the character, they of course couldn't do the whole fantastical Ancient Warriors thing, as that show was about as 90s as it gets. Still, they did need to give some sort of reason for why the Zyuranger stock footage showed the new hero in green fighting his supposed team.
So they went with brainwashing. Don't get upset just yet, this is the beginning of that cliche, cut them some slack.
But yeah, Tommy Oliver debuted in episode 17, which, okay, was this always a thing that we just never really noticed? Well, anyway, he was introduced as a skilled martial artist who could fight on par with the red of the team, Jason. His skills attracted the attention of the Bondora of this series, Rita, who turned him into her own personal evil ranger, who proceeded to wreck shop on the Rangers.
And again, while I've always had issues with brainwashing as a storytelling element, as I think it needlessly takes away agency from a still developing character, I can give a bit of a pass as long as they go all in with the concept. And oh boy, did they go all the way.
The original Green with Evil saga is rightfully considered to be one of the darkest storylines in the original MMPR. Legit, this stuff scared me back in the day, with Tommy just becoming the ultimate Knight of Cerberus. And while of course darker doesn't automatically equate to better, if focused in the right areas, it can be a very effective way of shaking up the status quo. Which this certainly did, as while the show didn't lose its more lighthearted, cheesy 90s tone, it did force the Rangers and the villains to step up their games. Most notably for this video, Jason, who in some ways was even more of a straight-laced babyface than Geki, really needed a 6th Ranger, or in his case, a proper rival to elevate his character. And while Geki and Burai definitely had an engaging sibling rivalry, it was unfortunately cut a little short after Burai's face turn, and the reveal that he only had a little over a day to live. I mean, don't get me wrong, he still had a great arc as we've already gone over, with him trying to live the remainder of his short life to the fullest. But it also did give his character an unavoidable ceiling and turned him into a bit of a simp for his brother. Thus, since Tommy wasn't literally living off of borrowed time, they wrote to flesh out his rivalry with Jason even after he joined the team. They still butted heads like a couple of teen boys with the bias of 20-something-year-olds. But yeah, even if they were sometimes influenced by the villains, they were constantly trying to one-up the other, which might have had some real-life context to it, but let's not get into that. Thus, even when they did need to remove Tommy from the show when they were running out of Burai footage, fans really wanted him to come back because he had become an integral part of the show, especially for Jason.
This unfortunately would kind of lead into the Tommy Oliver worship for the franchise, but that's its own can of worms.
And whether you approve of it or not, Tommy ultimately had lasting appeal, with fans constantly wanting to see him return and even revisit memorable moments of his arc, including of course Jason, with things even coming kind of full circle with the positions being reversed in Zeo, with Jason becoming the 6th Ranger for the final arc of that season. Toei might have taken note of this reception and incorporated it into their future series for better and for worse. We're gonna jump a little ahead in the timeline, as while not every 6th Ranger was Ko, I've even heard good things about Mega Silver.
The next relevant 6th Ranger, at least for this video, is also one of my favorites, Naoto Takizawa, aka...
This was where they went all in with the rivalry aspect, with him even becoming the 2nd Red of the team and initially being mistaken for Tatsuya, aka Time Red. Introduced in episode 28, wow, they can actually be patient with these characters. Naoto was a part of a special task force created by Tatsuya's father, as well as an old college mate of his, And while Red number 1 clearly wanted to be friends with him back then, Red number 2 grew to resent him, seeing him as a privileged rich boy, even though he was clearly trying to break out on his own. And yet, in Naoto's eyes, that was even worse, having been raised on the other side of the tracks himself, and seeing Tatsuya act like he was too good for his dad's money. Thus, he swore to try and outpace him at every opportunity he could, including, of course, as the leader of a superhero team, resulting in him stealing some very powerful tech that would also end up sealing his fate, but more on that in just a bit. But yeah, the rivalry between the two was a major highlight for this series, as much like with Jason and Tommy, it never really went away, as 1, he never really joined the Timerangers, and 2, even by the end of the show, he was still a bit of a...
He's an asshole.
Yeah, they made the two Reds of the show as kind of foils for one another, as while Tatsuya was a genuinely good, kind-hearted man, Naoto was a silver-tongued manipulator who would take any opportunity he could to, likely in his mind, earn power, as opposed to inherit it like Tatsuya. But again, Tatsuya was just trying to earn an honest living away from his politician father, while Naoto usurped power while disregarding the generous olive branches that were extended to him, like his college scholarship, as though those were things below him. So yeah, in many ways, you could see he was actually guilty of what he accused Tatsuya of, and was just self-projecting.
And that lack of introspection would eventually be his downfall at the hands of fate.
Yes, much like Burai before him, Naoto, pretty much because of his own hubris, was brought down a few levels. As not only was he inevitably downsized after all the shady methods he used to achieve his position in the task force, but he was also permanently downed after an attack from a basic foot soldier of all things. This was all because he became Timefire, as it was always preordained that the person who took up the mantle was going to die. And in the cruelest twist of fate, that person was originally supposed to be Tatsuya's descendant from the future, Ryuya, but he had learned about his own fate and thus let some other unwitting pawn take the literal bullet for him.
Thus, in some ways, you could say Tatsuya beat him with his great-great-great-grandson nailing the final nails in his coffin, albeit against the kind-hearted Red's wishes, as he had to witness his friend's death in his hands.
The two not only had a good classic shonen rivalry going, but they also really highlighted the show's greater themes of destiny. Tatsuya, kind of rightfully, chose not to follow in his politician father's footsteps by becoming an honest blue-collar worker, while Naoto did everything he could to gain political power. These differences in ideologies led to them clashing, but also kind of made them realize they weren't too dissimilar as a couple of men who wanted to defy their destinies. And eventually, through their interactions, they both came to realize that they were letting their defiance dictate their lives just as much as their perceived destinies. Thus, they decided to meet somewhere in the middle, with Tatsuya at least accepting a little bit of his responsibilities as a son of a politician, and Naoto at least becoming a little more humble. And while an act of kindness would end up putting him in the crosshairs, he was able to give his friend the will to find his own path.
Also, even if he was mostly a prick, at least he was pretty damn cool, and that theme.
No real point in talking about Naoto's PR counterpart in Eric, as they're mostly the same character, other than Eric not being nearly as big a putz and surviving by the end as a result. Not to say he was a bad character, or even any less than Naoto, and I am glad he appeared in later crossovers.
But yeah, he's not significantly different enough to talk about, so instead, let's take a look at another Toei property that was actually airing adjacent to Timeranger, and was even animated. What, you were expecting something else?
I mean, aside from the fact that Futai was still about 4 years away, this series is going to act as a significant bridge between these franchises, so it's worth bringing up.
Besides, this is one of my all-time favorite storylines in Digimon, so I'll take any opportunity I can to talk about it.
Now, while Digimon Adventure did have a 6th or 8th ranger in the form of Hikari, and she did play a very important arc of her brother and lead character Taichi, she wasn't all that interesting of a character and didn't go through that much of an arc. Again, not a bad character, but I think she was far outshined by the Kaiser/Emperor. First of all, Ken Ichijoji, at the time, did something very different for the Six Ranger archetype by appearing in the very first episode as he was the villain of the first arc of the series. Yeah, even though Six Rangers being at least antagonistic has been a thing since the very beginning, I'd be kind of hard-pressed to call most of them outright villains, much less one for an entire arc of the show. Thus, this was a case where not a lot of people were initially assuming he'd face turn into a Six Ranger and would more likely serve as the big bad of the show. I mean, right off the bat, he has strong rivalry with the lead character Davis/Daisuke, so of course you'd assume it's just going to be a straightforward good versus evil conflict.
Hell, it's kind of hard to want to cheer for a guy who kicks puppies. Then again, maybe we should just be glad that Araki wasn't involved in the show at all.
However, things took a bit of a complicated turn after the 9th episode. Throughout the first few episodes, Ken was established to be a young prodigy with enough skills to make Soji Tendo blush. As a result, he had gained a lot of notoriety and fame, and yet just from this one look and pose as he listened to an old interview he did, he didn't seem all that proud of it. A far cry from the tyrannical dictator persona he was putting up, as you'd think he'd enjoy the admiration. And yet, through an immediate flashback following the interview, we saw that people, like his school's principal, and even his own parents, tried to take advantage of his abilities. In the case of the latter, they only seemed to be interested in praising his achievements rather than actually seeing him as their son. People treated him like an object to be admired rather than as a person. Thus, while certainly arrogant, this sort of outburst wasn't unwarranted.
Also, can we just take a minute to appreciate the amazing visual storytelling here?
I already pointed out Ken looking away from the monitors, but there were also other little touches like him wiping his shoulder after the interviewer gave him a pat on the back. I just love stuff like this that speaks so many volumes with Ken holding a clear disdain towards the real world. And because of it, he retreated to the digital world, honestly believing that it was all just one big game who would at least have some degree of control over it, unlike in the real world. However, he would get a serious wake-up call from Daisuke after defeating his strongest creation, Chimeramon. No, yeah, we haven't really brought up this gogglehead all that much, because he does suffer from similar issues to some of the previous entries on this video, in that he was kind of bland, which according to the director Hiroyuki Kakudo was kind of by design, as they were going for the most anime protagonist possible.
Now, I wouldn't say he was a bad character. I mean, I know he was very divisive, especially Davis, who really ended up upping the jerk-ass tendencies for the English dub.
It also didn't help that he did feel like a bit of a derivative of the previous series lead, but he did have his moments, especially with Ken. The two met formally, as in without the goofy sunglasses, in the 8th episode. Though even before that, he was aware of Ken's talents, in particular as a soccer player, that he strove to be like. And when he actually got to play against him, he was creamed, and at best only got a barely legal slide in against him. Still, even a minor offense like that irritated Ken enough that he would later force Daisuke to take part in a sadistic choice over which of his teammates he'd save from being eaten. Fortunately, it all turned out to be a trick, but needless to say, Daisuke didn't take to almost pointlessly sacrificing himself all too well. From there, the injury from the soccer game exposed who he was, and our main lead had even more reason to hate the dude after learning that his idol was a bit of a monster.
With that in mind, he had every right to undress the guy, even after he did it to himself, but even a gogglehead like Daisuke could tell that even the worst of bastards have loved ones.
As along with Mr. and Mrs. Ichijoji, who are finally starting to realize their mistakes, there was someone else really pushing for him to return home, or more specifically, return to being the good kid he used to be. Yeah, since this is Digimon, it goes without saying that the titular partner is a part of the package deal that is the Sixth Ranger. Though Wormmon, for at least the first few episodes, was a bit more of a bit player, just acting as Ken's ineffectual right hand, until he started to actively rebel against him, recognizing that he was walking a self-destructive path that he started to notice after the aforementioned flashback scene, and only got worse as the losses began to pile up and Chimeramon's influence started to really do a number on his psyche.
Yeah, Ken has a very complicated relationship with that Digimon that relates to media outside of the anime and isn't really even brought up, so for the sake of time, we won't talk about it here for now.
The main point was that if anything was hinting at Ken's face turn, it was definitely this little guy, especially after one of the damn saddest scenes in the entire franchise. To deliver the final blow to Chimeramon, Wormmon sacrificed all of his energy, putting himself in a critical condition. And in the aftermath, having been made aware of his misassumptions about the digital world, Ken not only had to face the fact that he had enslaved and tortured many living beings, but he had also pushed away and ultimately drove someone else close to him into sacrificing himself for his sake.
Oh wait, did I just say someone else close to him? Yeah, about that. I apologize if your insides are killing you right about now.
Yep, this was when we got the big reveal that one of the main motivations behind him becoming a sadistic dictator was to escape from the real world, where it was heavily implied that his brothers saved him from an oncoming car. This was made even worse by the fact that one of the last things he said to him was,
兄さんなんていなくなってしまえばいいんだ
and while of course he didn't know the full story, Daisuke could tell this kid was suffering and thus should be with people who also wanted to see him again. He didn't necessarily forgive his old adversary's actions, but could tell he deserved at least a little sympathy. Part of that was because he had come into contact with a one-time power-up that basically told him to trust Ken, which, yeah, is more than a little plot convenient. But I also like to think that he was picking up that there was more to Ken during his tearful breakdown. And thankfully, Ken did start to mentally recover, especially after being reunited with Wormmon, thanks to the convenience of the Digimon life cycle. However, he would be forced back into action when new threats started to use tech that he had left behind during his time as the Kaiser. Thus, he and Wormmon, who was now able to digivolve into Stigmon, made quite the first impression as the new 6 Ranger team, to the point that this previous statement was pretty spot on. Seriously, Stigmon is one of my favorite champion level Digimon, and they were able to become quite the essential asset for the new mounting threat. Not that most of the 02 team recognized this at first, as understandably, they weren't immediately going to forgive him for all of the dealisms, and also they weren't initially aware of the fact that they were fighting actual soulless constructs made to look like Digimon. However, Daisuke was able to pick up that there was something different about him, and was the first to formally invite him to join the team.
And again, while I could argue his belief in Ken was a little forced, I do think this was also a good showing of his character.
This would reach its peak when he prevented his old rival from almost going on a Sudoku mission. Of course, he rightfully called him out and said nothing would ever truly be gained from having such a martyr complex. And from there, the two and their partners managed to connect emotionally, resulting in the first Jogris, or DNA Digivolution, which would become a vital key in their victories as the series went on. Ken's whole arc was a major standout for what was otherwise a very flawed season, thanks to being surprisingly complex and engaging little tale. It was so complex, in fact, that not all of it could be covered in the anime proper, and also required a whole video game to explain the origins of stuff like the Dark Spores, which did affect his personality into becoming the Kaiser. But even disregarding that continuity can of worms, it could still be viewed as a story of a boy lashing out his grief in all the wrong ways before being redeemed into a new hero thanks to the efforts of his partner and new friends. And while it certainly would have been nice if Daisuke could have played a bigger role in it, he still played his part admirably, and in the long run, his partnership with Ken did wonders in fleshing out his otherwise very cookie-cutter shonen protagonist personality into a lead who could understand the importance of familiar relationships.
Moreover, this would act as the basis for another 6 Ranger arc that the head writer of the show would take with him into his next big toy animation project, and what we'll wrap up this video with today.
So yes, it's finally time we talk about the other half of this duality video, Precure. What can I say, this is what happens when you do stuff chronologically. And while there were 2 or 4 6 Rangers, depending on whether or not you count the Kiryu sisters, and Kurumi was even an actual number 6 of her team, we're actually going to take a look at fresh Precure and the pairing of Love and the girl formerly known as Ys.
We're specifically skipping to them because 1, and let's face it, this is the most prominent 1st and 6th Ranger duel in the entire franchise, and 2, as I just said, it ties back into the previous entry with head writer Atsushi Maekawa.
Yeah, for the most part, I do believe the Sixth Ranger arc takes a lot of cues from Digimon 02 with a character who from episode 1 acted as a major villain of similar age to the main lead, and then after gaining some dangerous new powers, were forced to deal with a death before being rescued by the main lead, who was the only member of their team to trust them. Though fortunately for this show, it wasn't hampered by the wider franchise's complicated lore and continuity. As a result, I think we got a much more intimate relationship, which, yeah, has always been a thing with Precure, but at least the main lead here was a little more fleshed out. But yeah, Love did share at least some similarities with Daisuke. Obviously, both were very headstrong and impulsive. In fact, many in the Japanese fandom refer to her as Cure Bro, because she does have a lot more in common with your typical shonen protag than other pink leads. Though she was also very sensitive to other people's feelings to the point that she could develop tunnel vision. This would come to a head when she met a nice fortune teller named Setsuna Higashi. As well, she could correctly pick up that she was in desperate need of a good friend for reasons we'll get to in just a bit. She never did catch on to the fact that Setsuna always just so happened to be in the same general area as her main rival Ise, who also happened to be of a similar build and age. Yeah, not too surprisingly, the really sus girl turned out to be an agent for the villains who was covertly trying to undermine the Precure.
But why? Why would you do that? Why would you do any of that?
I mean, the obvious answer would just be that she's evil, but for Ise, it's a little more nuanced.
Ise was born and raised in a world known as Labyrinth, which was ruled by an entity known as Mobius. She acted as his denizen to spread his word by conquering worlds in his name. Now, of course, in her own mind, she likely saw herself as an apostle for a truly divine being and his cause, but as the series went on, something was clearly off. I mean, not only was the shadowy dude kind of obviously evil, but little things like her eating a donut for the first time suggested that she had never tasted anything like it before. It was as though she had been raised, or rather indoctrinated, into believing that serving her god was the only pleasure she needed in her life, even though objectively that is not at all a healthy way of living, which would become very apparent as we got into the Nakisakebe card arc. Much like with Ken, the deadly upgrade she got from her gaslighting god not only started to literally eat away at her, it also began to expose all of her weaknesses, in particular regards to her warped beliefs. And by the end, it became clear that Labyrinth was in fact a dystopia that was aimed to kill off the very concept of individuality in order to amass a loyal army for Mobius, whom we learned by the end of the series was pretty much Skynet. A supercomputer that the scientists of Labyrinth had created, but had gained sentience and took over.
So basically, the people of Labyrinth were following the word of a god of their own creation that was forcing them into a meaningless war and also depriving them of some of the basic necessities. Yep, can't relate that back to real life in any way, no siree.
Yeah, this was an element of Ise's arc that I really liked. The idea that she was kind of brainwashed like Tommy, though this wasn't the typical magical variety, but something far more terrifying. Societal programming, which was kind of literal in this case with the evil supercomputer and everything. But yeah, unlike when Maekawa needed to write in stuff for Ken involving a literal seed of evil growing inside of him, he was able to write a story here that was almost too real at times.
As the thing about this sort of brainwashing is that it's not the sort that can be undone instantly, and in fact involves getting a person to really rethink their very way of life.
Hell, under certain circumstances, it could even be argued that it's not the hero's place to tell someone that their entire way of life was wrong.
So it was just fortunate that she had a really crappy boss.
Yeah, even for a devout Mobian, it started to become very clear to even Ise that her god didn't give two craps about her. This was indirectly helped by love, showing her an objectively healthier way of life. One free of endless oppression, and with the ability to forge her own path. And even though she should have picked up on her new friend being a baddie, Love's optimism ended up becoming a key factor in slowly winning her over. Granted, it wasn't quite enough to undo Ise's programming, as even after an intense emotional scene between the two, which ended with Love finally learning the truth, she rejected her and even crushed a pendant that had become the symbol of their friendship. However, again much like Ken, the most significant shift in her character would actually come when she was forced to face the prospect of death. Though it wouldn't be for either of her cohorts that she didn't even really like, or any family members that didn't exist, but rather her own. Meanwhile, on the opposite end, while again the soon-to-be Sixth Ranger was doing most of the heavy lifting of the story, Love was also going through a character arc, at least more so than Daisuke, as even though she didn't pick up on her new friend being sus, her teammates certainly did, even before the big reveal. As a result, she did have to go at bat for her when Ise was genuinely trying to undermine them. Thus, when it was revealed that they were right, not only did she have to experience the heartbreak of betrayal, Love was also placed in a common and very important hero quandary. What do you do when the evil you're trying to fight is someone close to you? After all, is it not a Precure's duty to fight any and all evil without playing favoritism?
Since we do often bring this up in hero talks, let's once again compare this with the Fate franchise, specifically Stay Night's Heaven Feels arc. We're not going to talk about all of it, okay?
So yeah, putting aside some of the ickier elements of that story, I did like it as a final trial that Shiro Emiya had to overcome in the original visual novel. Without giving away too much, it was revealed that his girlfriend, Sakura, was slowly becoming the catalyst to a major world-ending threat. Thus, the obvious solution would have been to just end things before they got out of hand, which of course meant doing something that even Sakura herself was begging Shiro to do, as in her case, none of this was by her choice, at least not yet. On top of that, he had sworn to be a so-called hero of justice and follow in the footsteps of his father, who also believed in sacrificing the few to save the many. Love found herself in a similar position, with even her friends encouraging her that they should make the first strike. With all of this in mind, the two girls met for one final showdown, as both had clear grievances with the other. On one side was someone who literally had nothing else to lose because the pink girl in front of her had completely ruined her life. Meanwhile, on the other side was someone who had been not only deceived by the black girl in front of her, but had also been hospitalized and even briefly lost her mother because of one of her cohorts. Both girls had every personal and moral reason to want to destroy the other, and yet they didn't. For Ise, even if her life was coming to a short and sudden end, it was at least preferable to a long life of servitude and endless oppression that she had become acutely aware of, thanks to the honest and kind feelings that had been shown to her and allowed her to experience proper happiness for the first time. For Love, in spite of all of the lies and harm she had caused, she couldn't deny that the girl in front of her was suffering and that she had come to care about her. Call it foolish optimism, or even favoritism if you want, but sometimes the truest of heroes are the ones the most honest with themselves. Thus, while Ise, or rather Setsuna by this point, truly being killed off here would have been a poetic, tragic end to her story, her surviving to become pure passion felt more than earned, as this in my opinion was one of the greatest story arcs in all of Precure. While people will rightfully remember it for Setsuna's arc of essentially going from a religious zealot of a false idol to a kind-hearted girl who wanted to protect the happiness she once tried to destroy, Love also had a great arc, you know. Her views of what it meant to be a Precure, aka a warrior of justice, was constantly put into question. By the end, while it could be argued that she had made a selfish and kind of naive choice to help save a villain, and was only lucky things worked out for the better in the end, there was no arguing that she had maintained her title, and more importantly, her humanity. Thus, it's a pity that Love often doesn't rank anywhere near her friend in the popularity polls, but more on that next time. For now though, this arc remains a shining example of how to do a Sixth Ranger arc right for either of these franchises by utilizing the lead character very effectively. By the end, both characters, who had started off as bitter rivals, had grown significantly, and in the process really highlighted the theme of their show of overcoming oppression with the freedom of expression. It really did feel like a culmination of all of the previous entries of this video, hence why I doubt it will ever truly be topped.
And yet, Toei being Toei would try to do this with this franchise. Whilst also trying to figure out the proper formula. For Sentai. How well would it work out in the end? Well, come back next time, as we'll also finally do the little comparison that this has all been building up to.